European Association and part of Oxford for Europe, which is organising this event. Many thanks to Justin, who's somewhere hiding in the back, who actually organised practically this event and got us our speaker, who I'll introduce in a minute. But as I have your attention still in the first minute or two before it's lost, I'll just announce the other events that we've got lined up in the next couple of weeks. So 2 days from now, we have the Oxford West and Abingdon Hustings. For those of you who have attended East, you are allowed to attend more than one husting in the Oxford area, but certainly if you know people who haven't attended and are interested, especially people who are constituents in that area, it would be very good to have a full house for that. We already have, I think, almost 100 people registered, so we are looking at what will be a good discussion. Unfortunately, as it stands, the Conservative MP for that constituency is not attending the hustings, but we do have all other candidates attending, including UKIP, so it should be an interesting discussion. Yeah, if people do have ways of persuading that candidate to come, that would be great. So that's one event, 2 days from now, 7 p.m. Exeter Hall, Kidlington. On Fridays there is an event that we're not directly organising, but we'll be very happy to see a lot of people take part in, which is, I believe in 1 p.m. will be a choir singing, because Friday 1 p.m. at the Radcliffe Camera. I understand, because this is Bonn Week, Bonn being one of the twin cities of Oxford, there will be a choir singing Beethoven's Ode to Joy, and they want people to join in at 1 p.m. Friday in Radcliffe Camera, and of course bring flags and whatever other instruments you've got. And then finally, for now at the very least, the Saturday before the general election, so on the 3rd of June, we will have an Oxford for Europe joined with Oxford European Association store on Corn Market from 10 in the morning till 1 p.m. So you're very welcome. You don't have to man it, but you'd be great to see people kind of come in and give a buzz to that store as the day goes on. So that's enough about what happens in the medium to long term. Now for our short-term economic plan, we've got Jolyon Maugham, QC. One of the rare cases where somebody who's a tax lawyer has 41,000 followers on Twitter. I don't think they're all following you just for tax issues. I suspect some of them may have started following you as a result of those acute interest in what has happened since the 23rd of June. I'll also mention, just to taint him and make him seem even more biased than I'm sure you all imagine he is, that he does have a European stain, because as he was doing his undergraduate at Durham, he did go to Leuven, did cross the channel and did a year Europe, and I understand was even involved in European Union matters, which we may hear about a bit later. Since we, unlike some others, don't believe in false advertising, we will start by discussing Article 50 a little bit. But then I understand from Joe that he wants us to also move to talk about Brexit in the wider context, perhaps, and what explains about. We'll talk about EU citizens' rights. I'll kick off with a few kind of leading questions, and then we'll have you probing Joe in a friendly manner. So let's just welcome him. So your kind of recent claim to fame is the sort of Don Quixote-like attempt to try and get an answer to a question that the government doesn't seem to want to have an answer to, which is, once now Article 50 having been invoked on the 29th of March this year, should the UK decide that it no longer wishes to proceed with Brexit for whichever reason, and not doing so with the consent, or explicit consent, or unanimous consent of all other member states, could it nonetheless withdraw its notification and reverse to the point where we were more amicable sense on the 23rd of June. So do you want to just tell us a little bit about the Dublin case, so-called, what prompted it and where it stands now?
Sure. Yeah, I mean, it's not so much I think that the government doesn't want to know the answer. It's rather more that the government doesn't want to have to give that answer itself. Because the funny thing about this question of unilateral revocability, i.e. the notion that the United Kingdom can, just because it wants to, and irrespective of the consent of the other 27 member states, decide to withdraw its Article 50 notifications, that it actually places power into the hands of the United Kingdom. It removes power from the hands of the other 27 member states. Now, if you're the government and that question does come before the Court of Justice in Luxembourg, what do you say? What do you say about what the answer should be? Do you say, we can't unilaterally withdraw, we don't want power to rest in our own hands, we don't want to have the right to control our own destinies, we want that right to vest in the hands of others? A rather awkward position to adopt, you might think, given the narrative that prevailed in the referendum. Can you hear me right?
Can people hear Jim? Everyone here?
Cool.
Yeah.
If, on the other hand, they say, yes, of course, we want to be able unilaterally to revoke, that raises all sorts of equally difficult questions for the government. So, as I say, I think it's not so much that the government doesn't want to know the answer, it's rather that they don't want to have to be asked the question. Goodness knows what they will say. My guess, if I do succeed in getting a reference, is that they will say that the court doesn't have jurisdiction to answer it, but they won't actually say anything at all about what the answer should be if the court does have jurisdiction, because it's just too politically awkward for them either way. A few other points about the Dublin case. The first, of course, is a really important one. The job of the law, at least as I see it in this setting, is not to interfere with what the people want. I know and sympathise that many people say that the referendum was flawed in various ways, and it was flawed in various ways. But the mechanic for addressing those flaws does not lie in the law, it lies in politics. So we have to ask of our politicians that they weigh in the balance what they see as being flaws in the conduct of the campaigns by both sides, if there are untruths, if there is overspending, if there is influence from foreign powers, to weigh in the balance, the closeness of the result. All of those features are important, but for me they sit in the political rather than the legal dimension. So when you come to ask what the role of the law is, I suppose all of those points, so Carol Cadwaller's pieces in The Observer about funny spending patterns and respectively foreign influence and psychological warfare, sounds very exciting. Those features are all important, and the law can have a role in exposing them as being law breaches, which increases the pressure on politicians to take them into account in weighing the political scales. The question of revocability seems to me to have a slightly different role to play. So I think of the course of the next 22 months or whatever it is as being akin to us walking towards an exit door. And the purpose of establishing that the United Kingdom can unilaterally revoke is to place before the country at large an open door, another door, to issue the invitation to the country to depart from that corridor, not feel compelled to exit through that door at the end, but instead to present the country with an alternative. And of course it's then for the country to decide whether or not it wants to take that alternative. And let me just finish that thought then. And of course, we'll all have different views about what the impact of being presented with an alternative is. But in my mind, at least, that's quite a powerful thing in the political sphere. So it doesn't just, the questions are purely technical, academic one, but it has, prospectively at least, it has an important political consequence.
Okay, so let me try and probe this a little bit further, because the logic of saying there are all sorts of flaws in the referendum, but the referendum itself, the challenges, say, around the franchise, around financing, around lies, around these are all things that need to be settled in the political sphere, and indeed referendum, in the end, no one denied that legally speaking was advisory, and so it was for Parliament to essentially recognise its effect rather than the referendum itself. So if you take that same logic, though, wouldn't it be the case, or wouldn't many people say, well, surely, as and when the United Kingdom decides to change course, the EU 27 would not oppose it, and so you wouldn't run into the risk of having to unilaterally revoke because they'd agree that you'd stay. And so if you take statements from Donald Tusk and statements from Guy Verhofstadt and others, they would say, well, if you understand that you've made a mistake, sure, it would have to be done in some sort of a persuasive way, so not arbitrary, but arguably the UK, if you were to do this, it would be a vote in Parliament, it would be repeal of the Article 50 bill or a referendum. Then the question would then be really political rather than legal. So isn't it the case that this is also a question that has a legal answer, but that is the case with the other questions as well, but it's fundamentally as a political answer?
I think there are analytically a couple of points there. Certainly when I was trying to get the litigation off the ground, there was a group of MEPs, UK MEPs, who met with Guy Verhofstadt in Strasbourg to talk about the case and whether or not they wanted to support it. And Guy Verhofstadt's view was very much that it was risky and unnecessary for the litigation to be pursued because he was of the view that a political solution would be available if the UK came to that conclusion. And he, and indeed the Lib Dems more generally, were concerned that you might get the wrong answer to the question. And I wrote a piece about that, but in essence, I thought it rather misapprehended how, at least as I saw it, the political debate would unwind in the UK. I thought that there was a real risk of negotiations getting very, very ugly indeed. I thought that if they did, those interests in Europe that might presently regard us as an irritation might come to regard our departure as very, very attractive. And so I thought that it was punchy of Guy Verhofstadt to roll the clock forward a couple of years and predict with confidence that all 27 would continue to be happy to agree for us to remain. I thought it was punchy then, and I think it's punchy now. The other point to make, of course, is that if you go back to this sort of essentially national psychological portrait that I tried to paint a couple of minutes ago of walking down the corridor, if there's a door there that might be open, but you have to ask for permission, and it might be available, it might not be, that seems to be a very, very different picture from a picture of walking down a corridor where there is an open door and everyone tells you with absolute certainty that that door is open. And I think that that difference is profound and important. I also thought that the risks of not acting outweighed the risks of acting. I thought that, unlike the Dems, I thought now was the time to be risk-takey and dynamic, rather than just to assume that things would pan out as they hoped. I thought we were behind. I don't know if any chess players in the audience, but the adage is that if you're behind, you complicate, and if you're ahead, you simplify. I thought we were very much in a situation where we should be complicating. I mean, a couple of other points about the Dublin case, just briefly to mention. One is about the rights of UK citizens. So
maybe we can come back to that one. So what's the other point? Because there's a couple of things I want.
There's another point about the European Economic Area, and there's also a fourth point about the division of powers, division of competencies between, on the one hand, the UK and Ireland, and on the other hand, the EU, when it comes to working out what the shape of the border, I use the word shape in a very broad sense, will be on any Brexit.
So maybe we'll take those in order.
From the back, could you personally speak up a little?
Yeah, sure. So maybe we'll take those other three in order. I just want to probe a little bit further that first point of revocability, then maybe have other people contribute to this, and then we'll go to the second thing, which is as you say, rights of. Is that right?
Okay.
Sort of. Right of citizens. So the two things is one to actually to some extent support your kind of anxiety about Guy Verhofstadt. Interestingly, I looked just before coming here again, and when you log on to the European Commission site, where they now have the guidelines for negotiation, there is a Q&A section where they talk about Article 50, and actually in that one, they say unequivocally that their position is that there's no way back, there's no return, and that it's not revocable. So at least the position they put forward publicly is not the Donald Tusk position, it's not the Guy Verhofstadt position. The position they put towards the world is that it's not revocable. So that I think strengthens the argument you make, but for kind of taking that risk. But then let's flip this now and think, what happens if the reference doesn't happen, right? Let's not that the Court of Justice decides against revocability, but that there is no reference. So what sort of scenario do you portray then? We're kind of going forward. The Labour manifesto says there needs to be, they actually use the word truly meaningful vote, which I'm not sure is in any way different than meaningful vote, but there needs to be a truly meaningful vote at the end of the process in Parliament. The Conservatives also say there'll be a vote in Parliament. Is there a scenario in the absence of a reference where a vote against the deal can be perceived in of itself as having revoked the notification?
Well, this argument has been made in the so-called Three Knights opinion.
Yeah, exactly.
The notion being that a notification in accordance with your constitutional requirements which of course is what Article 50 requires, means that in the case of the United Kingdom's constitution, that notice must be revocable at the will of Parliament, because Parliament doesn't have the power to notify an unconditional withdrawal from the EU. I mean, it's an argument that is advanced, as you might expect, very elegantly. But for me, at least, and advanced elegantly by much bigger legal brains than mine. But for me, at least, it slightly stumbles at this hurdle, because it has the consequence that if you are a member state whose constitution permits of unconditional notifications, you would not have the right to withdraw under Article 50, and if you're a member state whose constitution admits only of conditional notifications, you would have the right to withdraw under Article 50, which would in turn mean that Article 50 has variant meanings depending upon who it is who's serving the withdrawal notice, and that all just feels a touch unlikely to me.
Although that may be a reading of Article 51, because it says the withdrawal is according to the constitutional arrangements of the state. And in some countries there might have been a government prerogative. In this country, the Supreme Court ruled that there needs to be a parliamentary vote, right? Some countries referendums are binding, in others are advisory. So yeah, I'm not convinced that in of itself is a killer argument for that. But yeah, maybe we can kind of throw this particular, before we move to the other question, throw this open and see if other people want to come in on this, on the issue of revocability and the role of Parliament at the end.
I've got one observation on the process of asking the question about revocability in a definitive way, and it comes from game theory. So the point at which it becomes guaranteed that we can revoke Article 50, if that's what happens, is the point at which the EU's best strategy is to give us such a terrible deal that you would have to be insane to go with it, at which point we go, oh well, the best strategy for us is to just call the whole thing off. So I'm not saying this is true, this is an argument that should have a lot of weight, but it's definitely one that has some reasonable theoretical underpinning, is that by making the question settled about revocability, and settled such that everyone knows it's settled, which is the critical thing from a game theory point of view, then you've just collapsed the decision space such that you've forced the EU to take the most rational course of giving us an appalling deal on the basis that they just want to force us to give up on the whole Brexit plan.
Well, there are a couple of hidden predicates, I think, in that analysis. And for me, the most striking hidden predicate is that the EU is desperate for us to stay. Maybe Guy Verhofstadt will be proved right, and our attractiveness as a member state will survive David Davis, as I read over the weekend, he's now known. But I wouldn't count on that. There may well be those in Frankfurt or Paris or Dublin who are attracted by the growing alternative centres of finance to the city, and those member states may be attracted by the thought of euro clearing, moving into the eurozone. So there are certainly countervailing arguments to the notion that whatever happens, the EU remains desperate for us to stay. It's also true that that involves another hidden predicate, an assumption that there is a deal that could cause us to choose to remain. That's quite a long way apart from the rhetoric of the government, believe it or not. It is certainly the rhetoric of the government that there are many deals that would not be sufficient to persuade us to enter into a deal. And so that strategy could deliver the outcome of us leaving with no deal at all in a way that is damaging to the EU and catastrophic for us, but we don't care because we're driving off that cliff regardless. So I think the analysis is complex. I'm sure game theory has an important part to play in thinking about it. And if you're me and you'd rather that we stay, it's also true to say, I don't suppose it has much bearing on anyone else's thinking, that I'd be delighted if the EU offered us a deal that caused us to be able to.
Yeah, and of course there's a very similar argument being poised in relation to the referendum, to a ratification referendum. So the idea that there will be a referendum at the end being some sort of an impetus for the EU to give us a bad deal because they'd want the people to vote to stay in that referendum. So, as you say, those are based on assumptions that are not necessarily substantiated. Other points on this issue?
Well,
Yeah.
I think the attitude of the European Union, in my experience, and I do work with them, is that one of the things that they aim for as a body is European stability, and it's hugely important culturally to why the European Union is there. And I think that how they approach the negotiations will be based on that. And personally, I feel that there may be member states that try and upset the apple cart, but the basic philosophy, I think, would be supportive of a stable Europe.
Yeah.
Well, I mean, it seems to me that the government wants to pretty much have the same sort of deal that we have now after we leave. I mean, if that's what they want, why are we going through all this? This just doesn't make sense, and nothing really adds up from where I'm standing. So,
Well,
and they're not going to get. I don't think they're going to get the same because once we've left the club.
I mean, lying behind that point is, I think, a really, for me, profoundly interesting question that illuminates both why we're here and also where we're going, and also perhaps how we stop getting there. And it's this: for only a very small number of those who voted in the referendum, I suspect actually for only a relatively small number of people in this room, is this really about the precise nature of our legal and constitutional relations with the EU. It's about something much, much deeper, much, much more profound. It's a struggle for the future of the functioning of our democracy, or it's a question about into whose hands do we pass the country. It's a question about whether we are fundamentally nativist or open, and all of those issues find a platform in the debate about our membership of the EU, but are not consubstantial with our membership of the EU. All of those things could turn out for the better or could turn out for the worse, whether we are a member of the EU or not. I mean, Hungary, you might think, is not a shining advertisement for democracy or liberality, even though it is a member of the EU. There are better and worse versions of the future of the nation that involve us being a member of the EU and not being a member of the EU. And the reason I make that point is because I think it illuminates really where our energies should now be focused, because disrupting, I know, the delicate chronology of questions you've arranged.
Yeah, no, go ahead.
It's your job to cope with that.
I
get to ramble.
I will, but
endlessly.
I do. I'm going to come back to something. Yeah.
But I think it's really, really important. I mean, I wrote this piece actually on the 28th or the 29th of June last year. It's really, really important, I think, for us to understand exactly what it is that causes us, a year later, flogging a horse that, if not dead, is certainly seriously unwell, to be sitting on a summer's evening in this room. What is it that we really care about? What is the thing that's really, really driving us to feel as passionately about this issue as we do? And perhaps to think about ways in which we can focus our energy on that issue rather than Brexit, which I suspect for many of us is just a proxy for that issue. Whatever happens with Brexit, the fight for the thing that figures in your mind as the important thing will continue. It won't end one way or the other.
Yeah. I mean, I think there's actually a way of getting back to this glacial space to the sequence, in the sense that I think you're right, or it strikes me that you're right, that it's very intriguing, for instance, when one reads the relevant section of the Conservative Manifesto. There isn't a separate section on human rights and the protection of freedoms. There is a paragraph built into the Brexit section that says that for the time being, that is for the duration of this Parliament, we will remain members of the European Convention of Human Rights, a body that's entirely separate. We were founding members back in 1950. And there's a separate paragraph that talks about how when armed forces fight abroad, they shouldn't be subject to human rights court and human rights lawyers. So I think you're right that there's something bigger going on here, and then maybe the reason for people being passionate about this. So I want this to be linked to our discussion on that other head, which is the issue of the future individual citizenship rights or status of the 60-odd million Brits who don't also have another EU citizenship, and so will, as it stands under Article 20 of the Treaty of the Functioning of the European Union, stand to lose, or arguably stand to lose, their EU citizenship and consequently EU citizenship right. But these are not the UK citizens who have moved elsewhere in the EU who may have rights, or may have those rights protected, but those who are here, who are immobile or have not been mobile. So maybe you want to talk about this, because it strikes me that actually is at the heart of much of this debate. It's whether there is that extra layer of protection. There's another, I'll stop my rambling, but there's another element that's very interesting in that section of the Conservative Manifesto, which is that on the one hand it says, we're of course not going to erode any rights, any workers' rights, any employment rights, any environmental rights, and then it says, but we won't incorporate the Charter of Fundamental Rights as part of the Great Repeal Bill, which by definition means there are certain rights that are only applicable in the UK because of the Charter of Fundamental Rights that may be gone. So it's trying to play that game of saying it's the international framework of rights that we oppose, perhaps, rather than rights per se. I don't know if you agree with that.
I mean, I'm amongst friends here, I'm sure. No one is recalling this hysterically, other than, of course, the man in the front. It is worth thinking about how European law has developed and the mechanics by which it's developed. So, back in 1962 or whenever it was, there was no creature known to international law like the EU. There is a project. It is a political project. It's a project that all of the EU institutions have contributed to, including, it is fair to say, the Court of Justice. The member states, the institutions have not always been able to function, and the Court of Justice has, on occasions, filled in the deficits in what those institutions have been able to achieve. And one of the strands of that activism by the court has been around EU citizenship. So there's a piece, not much read, published in a relatively obscure journal by Cohen Lennox, president of the court, in which he describes the stepping stones of the development of the notion of EU citizenship. And had we Brexited in 4 or 5 years' time rather than last year, had we had the referendum then rather than now, those stepping stones might have taken us further along the path of the notion of EU citizenship being a thing quite independent of your citizenship of a member state, consistent with the idea that some have of a federal sort of European superstate. The question, one of the questions that the Dublin case raises is whether the court has taken enough stepping stones already for it to say that all of us in this room who are UK citizens but not citizens of another member state can assert the continuation of our rights as EU citizens even when the United Kingdom ceases to be a member of the European Union. So that would mean that everyone alive on the 29th of March 2019 who is a UK citizen would have EU citizenship rights until they died, but no one else, anyone born on the 30th, would not have those rights. And
that's akin to the difference between not being granted citizenship and having citizenship once you have it revoked or cancelled or being denationalized, which is considered generally for state citizenship an abomination. So if the UK has discretion whether to give somebody citizenship, but once somebody is a British citizen, to deprive them of citizenship has to meet very weighty conditions. So that would be akin to thinking about it in those terms.
Yeah, I mean, absolutely. And if you want to preserve the integrity of the EU as a state with all of the what's the right word? All of the cultural advantages of statehood, you need to encourage people to think about their own relationship with the state. You need to acquire a sense of attachment, a kind of an emotional attachment, not just to your state, but also to the EU. And so the development of citizenship, the discourse of Guy Verhofstadt the last few months, I think is very closely connected to that. And I did go to Leuven as an Erasmus student, and I did spend a year drinking beer and meeting girls from lots of different member states. And it was a very, very pleasant year, and it made, not as pleasant as I would have liked, but it was still quite pleasant. And it made a, sorry for that rather dark allusion, it made a European citizen of me, and it turned me and all of my peers into a now quite powerful army of European mercenaries who will fight for a project that they dearly believe in. And I don't know whether Schumann or whoever it was who invented the Erasmus scheme had in mind the notion that you might all just hang out and drink beer and sleep with one another for a year, and that would create this kind of sense of nationhood embodied in the EU. But if
I will say that I'm going on Erasmus teaching mobility to Vienna in 2 days' time. That's to teach, and we send students. As long as one can. So what is the Dublin case actually asking in this context?
So what Article 20 says is that if you're a citizen of a member state, you have EU citizenship. What it doesn't say, what it's silent on, is what happens if your member state ceases to be a member state. It doesn't say what then happens to your citizenship. And there are a few cases that Cohen-Ennis, who was then teaching me constitutional law at Leuven, I wish I'd paid more attention. So those cases do go some way to describing EU citizenship as a notion that has a legal and cultural reality beyond your mere citizenship of the member state. So it is possible, it's politically quite difficult to think that we might not need the consent of anyone else to retain our EU citizenship rights. But then that might be to ignore the opportunity that the Court of Justice has to, as I say, imbue in this legal fiction some of the true incidences of nationhood.
Yeah, of course, it's not entirely a fiction, right? I mean, somebody can be a permanent resident in the UK and not a citizen of a member state and not have the sorts of rights that UK citizens have now in the other 27 member states. There are rights that are independent of British citizenship, that are contingent on EU citizenship. It is a real construct. I mean, I agree with you that it's, for many people, perhaps there is a generational thing here, right? I mean, Erasmus is an older program, but it's much bigger in recent years in terms of the numbers of people going, and that may have an effect. Do people want to probe this issue further? I mean, of course, there's another angle to this, which is the suggestion not that UK citizens will not lose their citizenship by virtue of extending, as you say, case law like Rotman and Zambrano and others that were on kind of individual denationalization to a collective denationalization, but rather that people will lose their citizenship or will get something else that will still make them different than other people in the world, right? That will make them some sort of a former citizen. I analogize this, I wrote about this, to a bit like being an alumnus of a university. So you're in a different situation than somebody who never went to that university, but you're no longer a student in that university. You still have some rights. In Oxford, you can go to all the libraries, you can have an email account, etc. So, do you think, from your interactions, discussion, that prospect of some sort of an associate citizenship has any traction?
No. Because I don't think it suits.
I don't think that's the issue. I think the issue is whether there'll be a change for the worse in terms of the rights that EU citizens of other EU countries who are here, the preferential, and I'll put this in those blunt terms, the preferential rights that they have as non-UK citizens in this country as compared with other migrants in this country. For instance, on things like the minimum income requirement for staying, the spousal visas, family unification, etc. Rights that are not just their own ability to stay, but the fact that they are currently treated on the basis that they enjoy equal treatment to UK citizens, in some respects even have better rights because of EU law. So I think that's where the risk that people feel lies. And I think on that, it strikes me, reading the manifestos, that there is some room for anxiety. So maybe you could calm that anxiety a bit more. Because I agree with you about the general decency and fairness, but A, I don't necessarily apply this to the Home Office, and B, I do think there's a bigger conceptual issue at play here.
Look, I mean, it's very, very easy for me to sit here and tell you not to be anxious. I'm a UK citizen, and I don't overlook the anxiety that comes from uncertainty, and nor do I downplay it. I'm trying to give you an assessment of where I think we as a nation are, and also where I think you'll be. But let me answer that rather harder-edged question. The English common law is a marvellous thing. It is living, it is supple, it is flexible, it is muscular when it needs to be. I do, and the rights that you assert are rights that can derive from black letter law, but they are also rights that judges can articulate or express, and will, I think, as a matter of pure English common law. And so, alongside that barrier of what I think the public at large will tolerate, there are an awful lot of Europeans, and we all like our European friends and neighbours. It's the ones that we don't know that we feel a little bit more uncomfortable about it. Ugly. We can find ugly historical frameworks that reflect that split vision of what it is to be a European living in the UK. But we will find ways to protect EU citizens living here, both in the public political popular sphere, but also I think also in a more legalistic sphere as well. So I think there are two layers of...
Yeah, right enough. There was somebody patiently waiting there, like, yeah.
Just on the, sorry, to slightly backtrack from that point on the EU citizenship, I listened to a German MEP and they said that they would consider it, if there was a nation paying tax as well, you don't get citizenship for nothing. And there's also the Citizens Initiative, isn't there, that's going on, where it's been accepted, and if 1 million people from across the EU sign it, then they will discuss it and take it seriously. So, I mean, there are other initiatives going on. You're talking about the courts, but I mean, there are other things going on, aren't there? And other MEPs who are interested in it. So, so what do you think about that? Do you think that, with some sort of reciprocal, like paying tax or something like that, do you think it's more likely to happen? I mean, money talks, isn't it?
So some sort of a membership fee, an individual membership fee.
I don't think it sits in the conversation at the moment. It might come to, if negotiations break down, we will certainly collectively try and find a solution. I think there are very, very few people who want to see EU citizens leave, even amongst the David Davises, the Liam Foxes.
I'm talking about the UK citizens retain their EU
UK citizens. And there will be a degree of, well, I mean that was the point that I was making about associate citizenship. I think the detractors and the supporters of various different types of citizenship right will fight their way to a score draw. So I'm not optimistic about that prospect. I can see the Court of Justice defying the political will of the Council and saying, if you are a UK citizen, you do retain your EU citizenship rights because they're separate from your UK citizenship rights, and so they continue. I can see that possibility, but what I can't see is a political solution being found that extends the notion of associate citizenship in a world in which the UK and EU are unable to conclude a withdrawal agreement that protects to whatever the necessary extent is the rights of UK citizens in the EU.
There was one question around, and then I'll go to the but I think reasonably sensibly to the Ireland question. Because in many ways, leaving the European Union but not leaving the single market and the customs union would not raise necessarily, or would raise far less questions about Ireland than leaving them would. Certainly leaving the customs union would, if my understanding is correct. So maybe you can talk about this more generally, but also specifically about what the Irish case tries to do in that respect.
Well, scenario upon which I'm even more ignorant in relation to the last question I was asked about the functioning of the EU institutions. But basically, in broad terms, I think the position is this. The Irish are adamant that there will not be a hard border, and for political reasons, because genuinely I don't think Westminster gives a monkey's arse what happens in Ireland. But for political reasons, the United Kingdom is also saying there cannot be a hard border in Ireland. And the EU 27 are also saying it will not happen.
Yeah.
But nobody has the faintest idea how on earth to deliver that outcome. And it is profoundly difficult. It's substantially impossible to achieve what everyone says must be achieved.
Unless you do. Unless
either.
Well, at the very least, in the customs union.
So I had this discussion late last week at a very classy panel. I was the sort of charity case sitting at the foot of the table. And they were all adamant that this was not, but no one, and there was a suggestion, because this was shortly before, the very same day the Conservative Party referendum's manifesto was published, there was a suggestion that we might not, after all, leave the customs union. That was put to bed a couple of hours later,
It's very explicit.
because the manifesto now says so explicitly. And it's really difficult to see how that pans out. It is another one of a really quite long list of issues that we've sort of parked for our own kind of mental and political convenience in a box marked, downstream to be sorted out later, without really having thought about whether or not they are capable of being sorted out later. And I suspect most of us in this room have doubts about whether they are.
Yeah.
Certainly I do.
Yeah, I mean, the Conservative Party manifesto, I read this explicitly, says maintain as frictionless a border as possible. As frictionless as possible for people, goods and services between Northern Ireland and the Republic of Ireland. And as you say, I think the EU guidelines that I read today say something like we need to find an imaginative solution for the island of Ireland. So that's what we are. That's what we are, right? Yes.
I'm wondering, talking about borders, what is going to happen with Gibraltar?
That's in the same box, isn't it? That's absolutely in the same box. Michael Howard can rattle his sabre in the direction of Spain, but life becomes intolerable for.
Sorry, I'll just interject. The question was about Gibraltar.
You already initiated a question back here.
Right. So the question was, what happens to Gibraltar?
Okay.
And the answer was the same as the answer to the question about what happens to the border between Northern Ireland and Ireland. And that answer is, God alone knows. It is not easy to see how you solve that problem.
On the matter about kicking things downstream or into the long grass of the kind of middle term, e.g. Ireland, you had a piece on your blog just a few days ago about the different views about the chronology of the negotiation, either X and then Y or X and Y together. And you commented on the difficulties of Mr Davis's position in that respect. But if the other side are clear about the view that the things that must be decided first, according to Article 50, include the border, then that rather puts a kibosh on kicking things down the tree, does it not?
Yeah, so they said three things, right? They say EU citizens' rights, they say the exit bill, and they say Ireland.
Well, why is Ireland in there? Why is Ireland one of those three? And the answer is because Ireland will have insisted that it is, and understandably, and you know, no one really wants to push back against that. But it's quite difficult to see how the mere fact of pushing it to the top of the agenda solves the problem. It remains as intractable as ever. Whenever it is in point of time you come to try and address it. So my sense is that was a recognition of the importance of the issue for Ireland, but does not carry with it any notion of how the issue might be solved. And I would be amazed if a lack of progress on that issue, that intractably difficult issue, were to be the thing that held up discussions more meaningful to the UK about the nature of the future relationship between the UK and the EU. I say more meaningful to the UK, I mean more meaningful to the UK economically in mercantile terms, because there are all sorts of consequences of our departure from the EU that extend far beyond the merely mercantile.
Right, so there are two more questions with Cathy and then
this isn't really a legal question, but you obviously mix in good circles in terms of hearing people are thinking about Brexit. Do you actually think we're capable of executing it at the UK and the current crop of ministers and civil servants? It doesn't seem to me, from the people I know that work in the Brexit ministries and the civil service, that anyone actually thinks we can actually execute. And so almost like this no deal, crashing out stuff, plus just the incapacity of Dover, lorries, Ireland, Gibraltar, everyone starts screaming about when Mini goes, when it all starts to disintegrate. Is there a kind of meltdown scenario that the law doesn't really matter? I mean, that's what I hear from people I know, but do you hear anything like that, or do you think it'll all just stagger on to a horrible conclusion?
Is your question related, or is it a different question?
No, it's sorry, it's not related.
Okay, so we'll while you answer this. And
is there an Armageddon scenario due to our incompetence?
No, you know, the very high class events that I occasionally get invited to have a very, very similar message to the, trying not to say lower class events that you get invited to.
It comes from Chelsea Flashe from the Exitonian.
That's much higher class. I do actually have that kind of idea. The message is exactly the same. People say, well, this is what should be happening, and then the question comes back, is it happening? And the answer is, well, there's not evidence of it. So, my personal impression is that a chaotic exit from the EU is very, very likely. Very likely. That will cause enormous short-term disruption, the likes of which it is impossible to calculate. I have a little pet theory, which I don't generally share. The IPA has advantages and disadvantages. The pet theory is this. We crash out without a deal, and the EU says, well, I know that the 2 years are up, but we're going to leave open until the next general election the possibility of you re-entering the EU on the same terms. Try, Theresa May, and resist that political pressure until 2022 if you can. I mean, I speak to the SNP, I haven't spoken to them much in the last month or so, but I was speaking to them quite a lot and at a very high level. They are adamant that their membership of the EU is separate from the question of Scottish independence. They are discrete issues. They're not, in their minds at least, using one as a mechanic to the other. Certainly, the UK departing the EU makes the case for independence much, much more difficult, and certainly profoundly more difficult. I think if you're an enthusiast for independence in Scotland, what you have to hope is that Scotland becomes a member of the EU quite quickly. I can see that happening. And that the hit of the rest of the UK no longer being in the single market is economically ameliorated by an influx of businesses and individuals, taxpayers from England to Scotland, because people can imagine moving up to Edinburgh or to Glasgow in ways that they can't imagine moving to France or whatever. So I think that if you want to construct the case for a thriving independent Scotland in the EU post the departure of the rest of the UK from the EU, that basically I think is what it looks like.
Going back, there were comments coming from what was said in the manifesto, a lot about what Mrs May has said and how this will affect negotiations and so on. But you haven't taken into account the fact that she's averaging a U-turn a month. So where does that leave, where's the ground on which these things are to be fought?
Well, it's the great unknowable, isn't it? There are two absolutely contradictory narratives of what this election is about. There's the narrative that it will increase her power over the headbangers in her party and give her the mandate to face them down and deliver a soft Brexit in the national interest. And then there's another narrative that actually she has no interest in doing that at all. And indeed, on the afternoon of the publication of the Conservative Party manifesto, Ian Dunt, formerly of this very room, published a piece saying that the manifesto was strong evidence that Theresa May wanted to deliver a soft Brexit. And minutes later, Philip Stevens, who writes great pieces for the FT, published a piece saying the manifesto is evidence that Theresa May wants a hard Brexit, and this prevailing narrative that the markets have bought is disproven by the publication of the manifesto. I'm more in the Philip Stevens category. I think there is a little part of Theresa May that quite likes the notion of the country being once again of a post-war posture where adversity compels us all to pull together and become self-reliant. Now, that's utterly impressionistic, but it does, that idea has some personal resonance for me. And I just don't see much evidence to suggest that Theresa May does actually want a softer Brexit.
We have a few more questions. I see flirting in the room. I mean, it is 9 o'clock. Are you happy to go on for a few more minutes?
I'm happy to take 2 more questions and then I will.
Yeah. Okay, so there was one in the very back, and then, yeah. So, sorry, I can't see you, but yeah, okay.
At the very beginning about the possibility of having two doors. One door would be us diving over the cliff, and the other door would be the possibility of a way out. What would be your strategy for opening up that second door? What do you think we can all do to try and get that door open?
Here's the uncomfortable truth. Absolutely nothing. I think it's, if anything, I think it's slightly counterproductive to be telling people that they were wrong about Brexit. I think people have to be given the space to work that out for themselves. I think that if people have a sense of those in the establishment hearing them, they are more likely to listen to the establishment on stuff like Brexit. And if they have a sense that the establishment is not hearing them because the establishment is still telling them that Brexit is a bad idea, that is likely to be counterproductive. It's that thought, anyway, that lies behind another project that I'm doing called the Good Law Project. I think I was asked this question at Henry Porter's convention a couple of weeks ago. How do progressive liberal voices make themselves heard? And I said, they make themselves heard by listening.